At 1742 hours on December 28, 1943, Commander Terence Shaw aboard HMS Glasgow detected 5 radar contacts approaching at high speed through deteriorating weather in the Bay of Biscay. The contacts closed rapidly. By 1800 hours, they were identified as German destroyers. Shaw commanded the light cruisers Glasgow and Enterprise escorting a convoy. The German force consisted of 5 Type 1936A destroyers from the 8th Destroyer Flotilla: Z-17, Z-3, Z-34, Z-32, and Z-37. Each mounted 5 15-centimeter guns. Combined firepower exceeded what Shaw's 2 cruisers could deliver. The British cruisers had 12 6-inch guns between them. The German destroyers had 25 5.9-inch guns. In a surface action, the destroyers outgunned the cruisers. This violated every principle of naval warfare established since destroyers were invented. Destroyers were supposed to be fast, fragile torpedo vessels armed with small-caliber guns. These German destroyers were effectively light cruisers disguised as destroyers. The engagement lasted 90 minutes. The destroyers closed to 12,000 meters and opened fire. Their shells landed around both British cruisers. Glasgow was hit 3 times. 1 shell penetrated the engine room, killing 14. The cruisers returned fire. Enterprise hit Z-27 with 6-inch shells that caused fires and disabled the steering. Z-27 lost way and fell behind. The other 4 destroyers maintained fire. At 1930 hours, Shaw ordered smoke and turned away. The German destroyers did not pursue. They had accomplished their mission by forcing the convoy to scatter. Z-27 sank during the night. Her crew was rescued by other German vessels. The action demonstrated what the Kriegsmarine had intended when they designed the Type 1936A. A destroyer that could fight cruisers. A destroyer that could escort battleships and cruisers without requiring additional support. A destroyer that combined the speed and torpedo capability of destroyers with the gunfire of cruisers. The concept was revolutionary. The execution was flawed. The ships were too heavy. The engines were unreliable. The seakeeping was poor. But the firepower was undeniable. 25 destroyers were ordered. 15 were completed. 4 survived the war. They were the most heavily armed destroyers ever built to that point. They remain among the most heavily armed destroyers ever commissioned. The story begins in 1938, when the Kriegsmarine concluded that their existing destroyers were inadequate. The Type 1934 and Type 1936 destroyers mounted 5 12.7-centimeter guns. This armament was typical for contemporary destroyers. British destroyers carried 4 or 5 4.7-inch guns. American destroyers carried 5 5-inch guns. Japanese destroyers carried 6 5-inch guns. The German 12.7-centimeter caliber was between British and American standards. It was acceptable but not superior. German naval doctrine emphasized individual ship superiority to compensate for numerical inferiority. If Germany could not build as many ships as Britain, each German ship needed to be more capable than its British equivalent. The solution was larger guns. The Kriegsmarine specified 15-centimeter guns for the next destroyer class. 15 centimeters was 5.9 inches. This was the standard light cruiser caliber. British light cruisers carried 6-inch guns. American light cruisers carried 6-inch guns. German light cruisers carried 15-centimeter guns. Mounting cruiser-caliber weapons on destroyers would create vessels capable of fighting above their class. 5 destroyers with 15-centimeter guns could engage cruisers on equal terms. This would force the Royal Navy to deploy heavier forces to counter German destroyers. This would strain British resources and create opportunities for German capital ships to operate without overwhelming opposition. The design was designated Type 1936A. It was based on the Type 1936 but enlarged to accommodate heavier weapons. Standard displacement was 2,543 tons. Full load displacement was 3,519 tons. Length overall was 127 meters. Beam was 12 meters. Draft was 4.62 meters. Propulsion consisted of 6 Wagner high-pressure boilers driving 2 geared turbines generating 70,000 shaft horsepower. Maximum speed was 36 knots. Range was 2,600 nautical miles at 19 knots. Crew complement was 321 officers and men. The primary armament was specified as 5 15-centimeter TBTS-K C-36 guns. The layout was 1 twin turret forward and 3 single mounts aft. The twin turret was designated LC-38 and weighed 97 tons. This was extraordinarily heavy for a destroyer. The turret alone weighed more than the entire main battery of some contemporary destroyers. The single mounts each weighed approximately 40 tons. Total main battery weight exceeded 250 tons. This represented approximately 7% of full load displacement. For comparison, British destroyers dedicated approximately 3 to 4% of displacement to main battery. The German design traded displacement for firepower. Secondary armament consisted of 4 37mm anti-aircraft guns in 2 twin mounts. 6 to 10 20mm cannons provided close-range defense. Torpedo armament was 8 53.3cm tubes in 2 quadruple mounts. Depth charge launchers and mine rails were fitted. The mine capacity was 60. This was typical for German destroyers which were expected to perform mine-laying missions. The combination of heavy guns, torpedoes, and mines created a versatile vessel capable of multiple roles: surface combat, torpedo attack, mine-laying, convoy escort. The type, 1936A, was intended to replace multiple specialized vessels with one multi-role platform. Construction began in 1938 at several shipyards. Deskimag in Bremen built Z23, Z31, Z35, Z27, Z8, and Z39. AG Weser in Bremen built Z30. Germania Werft in Kiel built Z26, Z28, Z8, Z1, Z1, and Z32. Deutsche Werke in Kiel built Z33, Z34, Z9, and Z36. The staggered construction reflected Germany's limited shipbuilding capacity. Multiple yards were required to achieve production targets. The first ship, Z3, was laid down on November 15, 1938. She was launched on December 15, 1939, and commissioned on September 15, 1940. Subsequent ships followed at irregular intervals through 1944. The primary technical problem was the LC-38 twin turret. Development was delayed by design difficulties and manufacturing challenges. The turret required precision machining and specialized materials. Production capacity was limited. The turrets competed for resources with cruiser and battleship turrets, which had higher priority. When Z-23 through Z-30 were commissioned, the turrets were unavailable. The ships entered service with single mounts in the forward position. This reduced firepower from 5 guns to 4. The ships operated with 4 guns until turrets became available in 1942 and 1943. Z-3, Z-34, Z-24, and Z-29 received turrets during refit. The others retained single mounts for the duration of their service. The weight distribution created sea-keeping problems. The heavy forward turret raised the center of gravity. This made the ships roll excessively in heavy seas. The bow design compounded the problem. The ships were designed with an Atlantic bow intended to improve seakeeping. The bow featured pronounced flare and a bulbous section below the waterline. The design was theoretically superior to earlier straight-stem bows. In practice, the Atlantic bow combined with heavy forward weight created a vessel that pitched severely and shipped water over the bow in rough seas. Crews reported that the ships were wet forward and uncomfortable in any sea state above moderate. The machinery was problematic. The Wagner boilers operated at 70 atmospheres pressure and 450 degrees Celsius. This was high-pressure steam technology pushed to contemporary limits. The high pressure improved efficiency and reduced weight but created reliability issues. Boiler tubes failed regularly. Turbine bearings overheated. Maintenance requirements were excessive. Engine room crews worked continuously to maintain operational status. The ship spent significant time in dockyard undergoing repairs. Operational availability was lower than planned. The Kriegsmarine had expected the Type 1936A to be highly reliable ocean-going vessels. They were instead maintenance-intensive ships that required constant attention. Despite these problems, the firepower was exceptional. The 15-centimeter gun had a range of 25,600 meters. Rate of fire was 6 to 7 rounds per minute per gun. A ship with 4 guns could deliver 24 to 28 rounds per minute. A ship with 5 guns could deliver 30 to 35 rounds per minute. This firepower exceeded what most contemporary destroyers could produce. British Tribal-class destroyers, which were the most heavily armed destroyers in the Royal Navy, mounted 8 4.7-inch guns and could deliver approximately 48 rounds per minute. But the German 15-centimeter shells were significantly heavier. Shell weight was 45.3 kilograms. British 4.7-inch shells weighed 27.2 kilograms. The German destroyers delivered less volume, but more weight per minute. The shell characteristics mattered in engagement outcomes. The heavier German shells had greater penetrative power and explosive effect. A 15-centimeter shell could penetrate light cruiser armor at combat ranges. A 4.7-inch shell could not. This gave the Type 1936A destroyers capability to damage cruisers that British destroyers lacked. In theory, 5 German destroyers could engage a British light cruiser squadron with reasonable probability of success. In practice, opportunities for such engagements were rare. Most Type 1936A operations consisted of convoy escort, mine laying, and operations against Arctic convoys. The Arctic convoy operations demonstrated both strengths and weaknesses. In December 1942, Z-3, Z-4, Z-1, Z-2, Z-2, and Z-30 sortied from northern Norway to intercept convoy WWII. The destroyers were part of a force that included the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and pocket battleship Lutzow. The force engaged British escorts on December 31, 1942, in the Battle of the Barents Sea. The German destroyers engaged British destroyers at ranges exceeding 10,000 meters. The British destroyers could not effectively return fire at that range. The German 15-centimeter guns had range advantage, but British cruisers, Sheffield and Jamaica, intervened. Their 6-inch guns outranged the German destroyers and forced them to withdraw. The action demonstrated that while the Type 1936A could outfight destroyers, they could not fight cruisers on equal terms despite their heavy armament. The most successful employment was against destroyer-sized opponents. On March 29, 1942, Z-26 engaged and damaged the British cruiser Trinidad during an Arctic convoy operation. Trinidad was forced to return to base for repairs. On the same day, Z-26 was sunk by British destroyers Eclipse and Fury. The action showed that individual Type 1936A destroyers could damage cruisers but were vulnerable to coordinated destroyer attacks. The heavy guns were effective at range, but the ships were not maneuverable enough to avoid concentrated torpedo attack. Losses mounted through 1943 and 1944. Z-27 was sunk on December 28, 1943, in the Bay of Biscay action. Z-24 was sunk by British aircraft on August 24, 1944. Z-28 was sunk by British aircraft on March 6, 1945. Z-26 was sunk on March 29, 1942. Z-35 and Z-36 were sunk on December 28, 1944, in the Battle of the Orcades. The pattern was consistent. The destroyers were vulnerable to air attack and could not evade aircraft despite their speed. Anti-aircraft armament was inadequate against determined attacks. Most losses occurred in coastal waters where aircraft could operate effectively. 4 Type 1936A destroyers survived the war. Z-23 was damaged in August 1944 and decommissioned. Z-25 was captured by British forces and commissioned into the Royal Navy as HMS Nonsuch. She served until 1949. C-29 surrendered in Norway and was allocated to the United States Navy. She was used for trials and scrapped in 1949. Z-30 struck a mine in October 1944 and was damaged beyond economic repair. She was scuttled in 1946. Z-31 and Z-38 surrendered to Allied forces and were scrapped. Z-33 and Z-34 were captured by Soviet forces and commissioned into the Soviet Navy. Z-33 became Provorny and served until 1955. Z-34 became Pryamoy and served until 1958. The assessment of the Type 1936A class is mixed. The concept of heavily armed destroyers was valid. Mounting cruiser-caliber guns gave individual ships greater combat power, but the execution created problems. The ships were too heavy for their machinery. The high-pressure boilers were unreliable. The seakeeping was poor. The anti-aircraft armament was inadequate. The tactical employment was constrained by strategic circumstances. Germany had too few destroyers to risk them in major surface actions. Most Type 1936A operations were escort missions, mine laying, and attempts to intercept Arctic convoys. These missions did not exploit the heavy gun armament effectively. The comparison to contemporary destroyers reveals the trade-offs. British Tribal-class destroyers displaced 2,519 tons and mounted 8 4.7-inch guns. They were fast, maneuverable, and reliable. They had good seakeeping and adequate anti-aircraft armament, but their guns could not penetrate cruiser armor. The Type 1936A could penetrate cruiser armor but suffered poor seakeeping, unreliable machinery, and inadequate anti-aircraft defense. Which design was superior depended on mission requirements. For convoy escort and general fleet duties, the Tribal was more practical. For surface combat against cruisers, the Type 1936A was theoretically superior, but opportunities for surface combat were rare. The American Navy studied the Type 1936A after capturing Z-30 in 1945. Technical teams evaluated the machinery, armament, and design characteristics. The reports concluded that the 15-centimeter gun was impressive, but the weight penalty was unacceptable. American destroyer design philosophy emphasized speed, maneuverability, and anti-aircraft capability over surface gun power. The 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose gun was considered optimal. It provided adequate surface firepower and excellent anti-aircraft capability. The 15-centimeter gun was specialized for surface combat and inadequate for anti-aircraft use. This made it unsuitable for Pacific operations where air threat was primary concern. The Soviet Navy operated Z-33 and Z-34 for over a decade after the war. The ships were rearmed with Soviet weapons and modernized extensively. The 15-centimeter guns were retained because they were effective and no superior alternative existed. The Soviets appreciated the heavy firepower. Soviet destroyer doctrine emphasized gun combat. The Type 1936A philosophy aligned with Soviet thinking. The ships served in the Black Sea Fleet conducting training and patrols. They were eventually scrapped in the late 1950s when newer Soviet destroyers became available. The legacy of the Type 1936A is the demonstration that destroyers could mount cruiser-caliber weapons, but the trade-offs were significant. Heavier guns required heavier displacement. Heavier displacement required more powerful machinery. More powerful machinery reduced reliability. The combination created ships that were impressive on paper but problematic in service. The concept influenced post-war destroyer design minimally. Most navies concluded that 5 or 6-inch guns were optimal for destroyers. Larger calibers created more problems than they solved. The Type 1936A represented a technological dead end, an interesting experiment that produced capable individual ships but failed to justify the design compromises required. This is the Type 1936A story. 25 ordered, 15 completed, 4 survived. The most heavily armed destroyers of World War II, 5.9-inch guns on a destroyer hull. Cruiser firepower in a destroyer package. Impressive specifications. Problematic execution. Poor seakeeping. Unreliable machinery. Inadequate anti-aircraft defense. But undeniable firepower. The buzzsaw destroyers that could outshoot contemporary destroyers but could not outfight cruisers despite mounting cruiser guns. The ships that violated traditional destroyer design philosophy and demonstrated why that philosophy existed. Fast enough to be destroyers. Armed heavily enough to be cruisers. Neither fish nor fowl. Impressive but flawed. That was the Type 1936A. The destroyers that carried 15-centimeter guns and everything that entailed.